His phone buzzed with a single message that shattered the quiet evening. "Call me immediately." It wasn't a wrong number. It was his lawyer, and the words that followed ripped open a truth no father should ever hear about his own son. The dinner he had planned, the warm meal he imagined, all of it collapsed into a storm of dread as the voice on the other end revealed betrayal hiding in plain sight. What could drive a son to plot against the very man who raised him? Subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you're watching from before the next twist unfolds. The knock on the door wasn't polite, it was a pounding, the kind that makes the glass in the window vibrate. He opened it to find Mark already inside, the frame, eyes sharp, jaw tight, the smell of expensive cologne mixed with cheap bourbon rolling in with him. The son didn't wait for an invitation. He pushed past his father like a man storming into an office he owned. The air of entitlement was so thick it clung to his boots as they thudded across the hardwood floor. His father closed the door slowly, every hinge groaning like it knew what was coming. Mark didn't sit. He didn't take off his coat. He stood in the middle of the living room, chest heaving like he had just come from a fight. The old man didn't move either. He leaned against the edge of the mantel, one hand resting on the stone he had laid there himself decades ago, back when sweat and calluses were the currency that built a home. Their silence wasn't peace. It was a countdown. Finally, Mark spit out the words like nails across the floorboards. "Sell the house, Dad. Sell everything. Split it down the middle. That's the only way this works now." The father let the words hang thick and sour, refusing to answer too quickly. He wanted his son to hear the echo of his own greed bouncing off the walls that had held bedtime stories and Christmas mornings. He studied Mark the way a craftsman inspects a cracked beam, already calculating whether it could hold or if it needed to be torn out before the whole structure collapsed. "You think this is a vault you can raid?" His voice was calm, steady, but it carried the edge of steel. Mark's laugh was short, bitter. "I think it's wasted space in the hands of a man who doesn't know how to use it. You're sitting on land worth 7 figures and living like it's the Great Depression. What's the point, Sel? Cash out. Give me what's mine." The father's pulse hammered in his temples. Every word was a blade cutting away the thin fabric that still tied them as family. He wanted to shout, to slam his fist on the mantel until dust rained from the rafters, but he didn't. He pulled in a slow breath, let it out just as slow, and met his son's glare with a gaze that had seen more winters than Mark could count. "What's yours?" he repeated quietly, as if testing the sound of the words. "You built nothing here. You carried no beams mixed, no mortar, signed no check. You think inheritance is a right, not a gift. You think a name gives you ownership, but it doesn't. Not here, not ever." Mark stepped closer, his face inches from his father's veins rising on his neck. "I've been patient. I've waited. But I'm done waiting. You're alone. You're old. You don't need all this space. I've got a family to think about. It's practical. Sell it now, or I'll make sure you don't have a choice." The old man felt his chest tighten, not from fear, but from the betrayal laced in every syllable. The boy he had once carried on his shoulders at county fairs, the same boy who used to beg for an extra scoop of ice cream on hot July afternoons, now stood before him as a stranger, a predator wearing his son's face. His pride cracked, but his resolve hardened. He straightened, taller than his age, should have allowed the lines on his face deepening with fire instead of fatigue. "You dare come into my house, the house that fed you, clothed you, kept you safe when you had nothing, and talk about practicality. You speak like a man who's earned something, but you've earned nothing. You want to take try. You'll leave with less than you came in with." Mark's fists clenched, the silence between them stretched, humming with the weight of everything unsaid. The memories now poisoned, the bond unraveling. The father felt the sting in his chest, not from the threat of losing property, but from the certainty that his son had lost his way beyond recognition. It was the deepest wound a man could carry, to realize his blood had turned cold, his legacy twisted into entitlement. The room seemed to shrink as Mark's shadow grew larger, but the old man did not yield an inch. The clock ticked on the wall, each second pounding like a drumbeat of defiance. He could feel his hands tremble, not with weakness, but with the rage he refused to unleash. To strike back in anger would be to stoop to the same level. Instead, he stood in silence, a wall Mark could not bulldoze. At last, Mark threw up his hands. "Fine. Stay stubborn. But don't expect me to wait around. The law has ways of dealing with men who can't take care of themselves." His words dripped with warning, the hint of plans already in motion. He turned shoulders, stiff boots grinding against the floor as he stormed toward the door. The father watched him go, the echo of each step carving new lines into his heart. When the door slammed, the house shook, but the old man remained upright, unmoved. He exhaled slowly, eyes burning, the weight of his son's betrayal settling on him like winter snow. He walked to the window, looking out at the land he had worked, the soil that had known his sweat. This house, this earth was more than property. It was history, sacrifice, proof of a life lived with grit and dignity. To see it reduced to a dollar sign by the very flesh of his flesh was almost too much to bear. Almost. But not enough to break him. He pressed his hand against the glass, steadying himself. The chill bit into his palm, grounding him in the moment. Behind the pain, behind the fury, something colder began to rise, something steadier. He would not let greed dismantle what he had built. He would not be cornered in his own home. The father turned away from the window, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. He knew what Mark didn't. Walls can be fortified. Wills can be written, and battles can be fought, not with fists, but with patience, strategy, and a pen sharper than any blade. And as the night closed in around the house, his resolve hardened like concrete curing in the dark. Mark believed he could take everything with pressure and threats. He had no idea what awaited him, because his father was not broken, not yet. And when the time came, he would learn a truth far harsher than the one he had tried to deliver tonight. The question now wasn't whether a son could betray a father. That had already been answered. The real question was how far a father would go to remind his son that some things could never be stolen. The house was still trembling from the slam of the door when he lowered himself into his chair by the window. His pulse was still hammering from the confrontation, his jaw aching from clenching it too hard. The words his son had spit at him echoed through the walls like poison refusing to fade. He pressed his fingertips to his temples, fighting off the storm, and that was when another image cut through the haze. It wasn't the sneer on Mark's face or the threat in his voice. It was Evan, the boy caught in the middle of a war he never asked for. He remembered the last time he saw him, a raw December afternoon when the wind had knifed through the bare trees. Evan had been standing on the porch of his father's house, shoulders hunched, arms wrapped tight around himself, a thin cotton hoodie clinging uselessly against the cold. The boy's breath puffed out in pale clouds as he kicked at the gravel with shoes that looked one season too small. His lips had trembled as he tried to smile, and the old man had felt something inside him crack. It wasn't just the cold that clung to the child. It was something sharper, invisible, more brutal. He had seen the way Mark's hand clamped down on the boy's shoulder, not affectionate, not protective, but punishing. He had heard the sharp bark of commands disguised as parenting, the way Evan's small frame stiffened every time his father spoke. Rules, discipline, order, words that could guide a child when spoken with love, but in Mark's voice they were weapons. He had wanted to say something then, to step in, to drag the boy into his own car and drive away. But Evan's eyes, wide and pleading, had begged him not to start a war on that porch. So he had swallowed his anger, told himself he would watch closely, that he would wait for the right moment. Now, after the venom Mark had spewed in his living room, waiting felt like cowardice. He rose from the chair and paced the room, fists tight at his sides. Every step stirred memories of his own father, a man of iron discipline, a man who believed punishment built character. He had felt that sting on his own back, the coldness of words meant to harden but only carving scars. He had sworn when he became a father that he would never repeat it. And yet here it was, reborn in his own bloodline, passed down to his grandson like some cursed inheritance. The old man stopped at the mantel, his eyes falling on a photograph in a worn wooden frame. It was Evan, at age 6, cheeks flushed, hair sticking up in the back as he blew out the candles on a chocolate cake. His hands were still sticky with frosting, his smile so pure it hurt to look at now. That boy deserved warmth, safety, the kind of love that wraps around you like a blanket in the middle of winter. Not cold garages, not silence for mistakes, not punishment for being a child. He could hear the faint echo of Evan's voice in his head, that last voicemail he had left weeks ago. The words had been brave, casual even, but the sound of teeth chattering behind them gave everything away. "I'm fine, Grandpa. Really, just had to sleep out here tonight. Dad says it builds toughness." Toughness. He had gripped the phone so tightly the plastic cracked. No child should have to prove his worth with frost in his lungs. The rage came then, hot and sudden, but it wasn't reckless. It was focused. It sharpened into resolve, into a plan forming in the shadows of his mind. He would not stand by and let another generation be broken by cruelty dressed as discipline. He would not let Evan carry those invisible bruises into adulthood, would not let him grow up believing love was a transaction you earned through silence and obedience. He moved to the desk in the corner of the room, pulled open the drawer, and took out the small spiral notebook he always kept. Its pages were filled with numbers, reminders, scraps of ideas for projects he never started. Tonight it became something else. He flipped to a fresh page and wrote a single line at the top in block letters. "Protect Evan at all costs." His hand shook, but not from weakness. It was the tremor of purpose finding its way back into tired bones. He listed what he knew, the times he had seen the boy's clothes too thin, his meals skipped, the bruises brushed off as accidents. He wrote down dates, places, names, evidence. If Mark wanted to play with lawyers and courts, then fine. The old man would meet him there, but this time he would not be the one on trial. The pen dug deep into the paper as he underlined Evan's name. He whispered it aloud, letting the sound of it fill the empty house. That boy was not going to grow up believing cruelty was normal. Not while he still drew breath. He leaned back in the chair, the house quiet except for the wind pushing against the windows. For the first time that night he felt steady. The betrayal of a son had cut deep, but the love for a grandson carved deeper still. And that love, fierce and unyielding, was about to turn into something Mark had never seen before. Because a man might bend when his pride is attacked, but threaten his blood, his legacy, his hope for the future, and he will rise with a strength born from generations. The old man closed the notebook, set it down with finality, and looked back at the window. Somewhere out there Evan was shivering, believing no one saw him. But someone did. And that someone was ready to fight in ways his son could never imagine. The night pressed close, heavy with secrets, but the next move was already taking shape. The night carried a heavy silence, broken only by the low hum of the furnace in the basement and the faint creak of old timbers shifting against the cold. He stood in the center of the living room, his chest rising and falling like a man steadying himself before battle. Mark was still there, pacing like a wolf in a cage, eyes flashing with entitlement, the faint smell of whiskey still clinging to his words. The father had listened long enough. Mark's demands had spilled out like poison, each word erasing another memory of the boy he had raised. He had endured the tirade, the threats, the accusations, but now a different current coursed through him. It wasn't weakness, it wasn't despair, it was resolve. His hand tightened on the mantel, his knuckles pale, and when he turned toward his son, his voice cut like a blade. "This house isn't a bank you rob when you're short," he said, low but sharp enough to still the air. He stepped closer, closing the space between them, his shadow stretching across the hardwood. "You're not short. You're greedy." The words landed like a hammer. For the first time, Mark flinched. Just a flicker, a tightening of the jaw, but the father saw it. He pressed forward, not with fists, but with the weight of truth. "You come here demanding what you never earned, standing on floors. You didn't build walls you never raised, and you expect me to hand it over. Not while I'm still breathing." Mark scoffed, but it lacked the bite it once carried. He turned his back, trying to mask the sting, But the old man's voice followed him. "You think age makes me weak? You think solitude makes me desperate? Let me tell you something, son. Weakness is believing you're entitled to another man's work. Weakness is leaning on your father's sweat instead of your own spine. And you've shown me tonight that you're weaker than I ever imagined." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke. Mark spun around, his face red, but his words stumbled as if his tongue had finally betrayed him. He tried to muster the same fire, but the room no longer belonged to him. The authority he carried when he walked in had been stripped bare. The father pointed to the door, his arm steady as steel. "Get out." Mark froze. His lips parted, then closed. He had expected bargaining, expected hesitation, maybe even tears. What he hadn't expected was the unshakable wall standing before him, a man who had decided there would be no more negotiations. "I said get out," the father repeated, his voice calm but thunderous in its certainty. For a long moment Mark stared at him, searching for a crack, a weakness, anything to exploit. But there was nothing. Only resolve. Only the unflinching eyes of a man who had already buried his grief and now stood ready to bury his son's illusions, too. Mark's hand twitched at his side. Then he grabbed his coat off the back of the chair, yanking it hard enough to topple it. The sound of wood scraping across the floor was sharp, but the father didn't flinch. He watched as Mark stormed toward the door, his boots striking like gunshots, his rage filling the room like smoke. At the threshold, Mark paused, turning with a look meant to wound. "You'll regret this," he hissed. "You'll die alone in this house. And when you do, everything will be mine anyway." The father's gaze didn't waver. "Then I'll die knowing I never bowed to greed. And that's a better death than living on my knees." Mark's face twisted, caught between fury and disbelief, but he said nothing more. The door slammed behind him, the echo rattling through the frame, but the house felt lighter, freer, as though it had been holding its breath until now. The old man exhaled, the weight of decades pressing on his shoulders but not bending them. His chest ached, not from fear but from the raw wound of expelling his own blood from the house he had built. Yet beneath the sting there was a fire, steady and bright, one that had been dormant too long. He crossed the room slowly, his footsteps deliberate, each one carrying the echo of his defiance. He opened the curtains and stared out into the night. The yard lay in silence, the trees skeletal against the moonlight, and somewhere in that cold darkness his grandson was sleeping under rules too cruel for a child. The thought carved into him, but now it no longer bred despair. It bred purpose. He closed the curtains again and stood in the quiet. For years he had tried to keep the peace, tried to believe that patience would mend what was breaking, but tonight had stripped away all illusions. The man who had stormed into his home was not the boy he had raised. He was something else, something twisted by greed and arrogance. The father tightened his fist at his side, the blood surging with a younger man's fury. He knew the battle wasn't over. Mark would be back, not with fists, but with papers, not with shouts, but with schemes. The warning had been clear, the fight had only just begun. He looked around his home at the photographs lining the walls, the worn furniture carrying the weight of decades, and he swore silently that it would not be stripped from him. This house was more than wood and nails. It was memory, legacy, proof of sacrifice. And if Mark thought it could be stolen with threats and signatures, he was about to learn a lesson his father had been preparing his entire life to teach. The night pressed in cold and merciless, but inside the fire burned hotter than ever. The father had drawn a line, and for the first time in years he felt alive, standing tall in the face of betrayal. The next chapter of this war was already gathering beyond the horizon, and when it came he would be ready. Because when a man has nothing left to lose but his dignity, he becomes untouchable. And Mark had just created a man who would stop at nothing to protect what was his. The morning broke gray and thin, a light mist crawling over the fields, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. He sat at the kitchen table with a black coffee cooling untouched, the silence of the house pressing against him like a weight. The night before still throbbed in his chest, the memory of his son's voice, the venom in his words, the echo of the door slamming shut. But the silence didn't last long. The phone buzzed against the wood, a private number flashing across the screen. He answered with a steady voice, though his gut twisted as though it already knew. "Alan," he said, leaning back in the chair. The lawyer's voice was firm, but the edge of urgency cut through it. "We need to talk now, and not tomorrow. Not next week. Now." The father's grip tightened around the phone. Alan wasn't a man to waste words. They had known each other for 30 years through contracts, disputes, small-town politics. He knew the rhythm of his speech, and this wasn't it. This was different. "I've just come from the courthouse," Alan continued. "Your son has been asking questions, dangerous ones. He's spoken to people about power of attorney, about competency hearings. He's laying the groundwork to have you declared unfit. If he pulls it off, your decisions won't matter anymore. He'll control everything." The words sliced through him like glass. Declared unfit. Reduced to a signature stripped of meaning, a man erased while still breathing. The betrayal last night had been brutal, but this was worse. This wasn't rage in the moment, it was premeditated theft sharpened into strategy. The father rose from the chair, his feet carrying him to the window without thought. Outside, the mist clung to the yard, blurring the edges of the fence posts, the outline of the barn. He pressed his palm against the glass, steadying himself against the surge of heat in his veins. "He wants to bury me alive," he muttered, more to himself than to Alan. Alan's voice cut in low and deliberate. "You need to act now. I can file paperwork today to reaffirm your competency, strengthen the deed, lock down the trust. It won't stop him from trying, but it will give us a wall to fight behind. Without it, he'll have every tool he needs to take your land, your house, every cent in the accounts." The father's eyes hardened. He had expected greed, entitlement, even fury. But this attempt to reduce him to a husk was a depth he hadn't imagined. For a son to weaponize the law against the man who raised him was a cruelty beyond fists or insults. It was a knife slipped quietly between the ribs. His voice was steady, but his hand trembled slightly against the glass. "Do it," he said. "Whatever it takes, do it. Lock it down." "All right," Alan replied. "But understand this, he's not acting alone. These kinds of moves don't come from thin air. Someone's advising him. Someone's feeding him this path. Keep your eyes open. This isn't just a family quarrel anymore. It's a war on paper, and those wars leave scars that don't heal." The father let the words sink in, each syllable dragging him deeper into the reality he now faced. His son wasn't just angry. He was armed with knowledge, allies, maybe even lawyers of his own. The living room still held the echo of their fight, but what lay ahead would be colder, quieter, fought in offices with pens instead of fists. He turned from the window, pacing slowly, every step deliberate. His gaze fell on the photographs lining the wall, the ones Mark had once smiled in before the shadows of greed had hollowed him out. He lingered on one in particular, a family trip to the lake. Mark holding a fishing rod too big for his small hands, grinning with pride at the catch dangling from the line. A boy who once looked up at his father with trust now stood plotting his downfall. The photo blurred as his eyes burned, but he refused to look away. "Alan," he said finally, "he's not just trying to steal from me. He's trying to erase me. He wants the story to end before I'm ready." The line went quiet for a moment before Alan answered, his tone heavier now. "Then we make sure it doesn't. I'll draft the documents tonight. You'll sign them in the morning. Until then, keep your guard up. And for God's sake, don't let him near anything you own." The call ended, but the silence that followed wasn't peace. It was the kind of silence that comes before thunder, a warning that the storm had only begun. He placed the phone on the table, the screen glowing faintly in the dim light, and sank back into his chair. His coffee was cold, untouched, but his mind was burning. His thoughts drifted to Evan again, to the boy caught in this crossfire, shivering in garages, punished under the guise of discipline. If Mark could strip his father's dignity without hesitation, what chance did a child have? The thought festered, fueling the anger into something sharper, colder. Protecting his legacy was no longer about land or money. It was about shielding what remained of innocence in a world turned merciless by greed. The old man pushed back the chair and stood taller than his years should have allowed. He walked to his desk, pulled open the bottom drawer, and removed a stack of files Alan had prepared years earlier. He spread them out across the surface, the paper whispering against the wood. Titles, deeds, insurance trusts, all of it laid bare under the dim lamp. The signatures were his, the work was his, the sweat behind every word belonged to him, and no one, not even blood, would strip it away without a fight. He traced a finger along the top page, the ink of his name bold and steady. It wasn't just a signature, it was a declaration. He was still here. He was still capable. And no piece of paper filed by a greedy son would rewrite that truth. The furnace clicked on in the basement, a low rumble filling the silence. He straightened his back, the fire in his chest steadying into resolve. If Mark wanted war, he would have it. But it would not be the victory he imagined. He closed the drawer, locked it, and pocketed the key. Tomorrow Alan would bring the new documents, the safeguards, the walls that would hold. Tonight he would sit in this house, his house, and remind himself of everything he had built, everything worth protecting. But deep in the quiet, he knew this was only the beginning. And somewhere in the shadows, Mark was already planning his next move. The phone rang late in the afternoon, its shrill cry cutting through the quiet house like a blade. He almost didn't answer. After the call with Alan, every sound felt suspect, every voice a potential weapon. But the display lit up with a familiar name, and something inside him tightened. Mark. His thumb hovered over the button, a war waging in that single second. When he pressed it, the silence that followed was heavier than the ringing. Dad Mark's voice came soft, smoother than it had been in years. It was stripped of the venom from the night before, stripped of the entitlement that had bled from his every word. "I'm sorry." The father closed his eyes, leaning back in the chair. He let the word sink in, testing its edges. Sorry. It should have carried weight, should have mended something, but instead it felt hollow, too polished. He had heard salesmen use that tone, men who could make you believe a broken deal was your idea all along. "I shouldn't have come at you like that." Mark continued, his voice low, calculated. "I was out of line. I've been under pressure. Things at work, the bills, the kids. It just boiled over. You didn't deserve it." The father's jaw tightened. He thought of Alan's warning, the quiet schemes moving behind courthouse walls. He thought of the word incompetent whispered in legal corridors. And yet, here was his son speaking like the boy who used to sit at his knee, asking for stories about how the barn was built, how the family name had been carved into the land. "I've been thinking," Mark said. "Why don't we sit down together? Just us. No shouting, no threats. A meal, like we used to. Do you remember Chapel House by the river? They still make that roast you liked." Chapel House. The name struck like a bell in his chest. It had been their place years ago when Helen was alive, when Sundays meant piling into the truck and driving out to that weathered brick inn where the walls smelled of oak and the river sang just beyond the windows. They had celebrated birthdays there, anniversaries, even the day Mark brought home his college acceptance letter. That place held laughter thick enough to taste, and now his son was dangling it like bait. The old man gripped the phone tighter, his pulse thudding in his ears. The memory of Evan's shivering voice replayed in his mind, the knowledge of legal papers already in motion pressing down on him. Trust was no longer simple, love no longer blind. Just dinner. Mark pressed. "I'll make the reservation. Tonight, 6 o'clock. No agendas, no fights. I just want to fix this. Fix this." The words burned. You don't fix betrayal with a meal. You don't mend a wound with roast beef and soft lighting. And yet there was a part of him, a scarred but stubborn part, that longed to believe. That wanted to sit at that old wooden table, to taste the bread warm from the oven, to hear his son speak without daggers in his mouth. He said nothing for a long moment. The silence stretched so thin he could almost hear Mark's breath on the other end, controlled waiting. "I'll think about it," the father said finally, each word measured. Mark's relief came too quickly, too eager. "That's all I ask. I'll call you back with the details. You'll see, Dad. We'll set things right." The line went dead, leaving him with the hum of the empty house. He lowered the phone slowly, setting it on the table as though it carried weight enough to crack the wood. He stared at it, the name still glowing faintly, and every instinct screamed that the apology was a mask, the dinner a stage, the chapel house no longer a sanctuary, but a trap dressed in nostalgia. He walked to the study, the air colder now, and pulled open the drawer where Alan's documents lay. He traced a finger across his own signature, bold and defiant, then closed the folder again. His son thought sentiment could undo resolve. His son thought the past could be used as a leash. But the old man was not the same man he had been at Chapel House years ago. He was harder now, sharper. And yet beneath the steel there lingered something else, something he despised as much as he needed. Hope. Hope that maybe Mark's words carried truth. Hope that maybe a meal could do what threats could not. But hope was dangerous, and he knew it. He had lived too long, lost too much to mistake a smile for salvation. The clock ticked toward evening, each second pushing him closer to the choice. He stood by the window watching the light fade over the yard, the trees bowing in the wind. Somewhere in the distance he imagined Chapel House, its windows glowing against the river tables set a family once whole. He closed his eyes, exhaling slow. Whether he went or not, the path forward would not be simple, because the invitation wasn't just dinner. It was a line drawn in shadows, a test of trust against suspicion. And he knew as the wind rattled the glass that one wrong step could cost him more than a house, more than land. It could cost him everything. The evening had settled heavy over the house, the kind of stillness that makes the ticking of the clock sound louder than it should. He was pacing the length of the living room, his son's words still echoing like poison in the walls, when the phone lit up again. It wasn't Mark this time. The screen showed a name that made his chest clench, Evan. His thumb hovered for an instant, but before he could swipe the call, vanished, replaced by the blinking light of a voicemail. He pressed play. The line crackled with static. At first, then came the boy's voice, soft and uneven, trying to sound braver than he was. "Hi, Grandpa. It's me. I'm okay. Just wanted to say goodnight." There was a pause, and in the silence he heard it, the faint rattle of teeth chattering, the breath coming in short clouds of air. Then the whisper, almost buried in the static, "Dad says I have to stay out here tonight. It's supposed to make me tougher. Don't worry. I'm okay." The message clicked off, but the sound of it lingered, clawing at his ribs. He replayed it once, twice, 3 times, each time hearing more than the boy intended him to. The way his voice shook the brittle edge of forced calm, the echo of emptiness in the background that could only be the garage where cold cement floors swallowed warmth whole. He gripped the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. He could picture it as clearly as if he stood there himself. The boy curled under a thin blanket, breath fogging in the air, the hum of a refrigerator rattling against metal shelves, the concrete beneath him leaching the heat from his body. A punishment, Mark called it. A lesson. But all it was cruelty disguised as discipline. The old man sank into his chair, the phone pressed against his chest, and for a moment his eyes burned. He thought of his own winters as a boy, sleeping under patched quilts while wind howled through the cracks of an uninsulated farmhouse. It had been hard, yes, but he had never been forced into it. Poverty had been the enemy then, not his own father. The thought that his grandson was suffering not from circumstance but from choice. A father's choice stabbed deeper than any insult Mark had thrown at him. He played the voicemail again, closing his eyes. The words, "I'm okay," repeated, but each time they sounded less convincing. It was the kind of phrase a child used to protect someone else, to keep them from worrying. A child shouldn't have to carry that burden. A child shouldn't have to lie to make his suffering easier for others to bear. He set the phone on the table, staring at it as though it might speak again. His hands trembled, but not from age, from rage. He wanted to storm into Mark's house, rip open the garage door, and drag Evan out into the light. He wanted to shout until the walls shook to demand how a man who had once been held with love could show so little of it to his own son. But rage was a blunt instrument, and blunt instruments break more than they fix. He forced himself to breathe, to think. The boy needed more than an outburst. He needed protection, something lasting, something that could not be stripped away by another apology or hidden behind the facade of tough love. He rose from his chair and began pacing again, the phone in his hand like a live coal. Each step was measured, deliberate, but his mind was racing faster than his body could keep up. Alan's warning rang in his ears: legal papers, competency, challenges, traps waiting to spring. If Mark was willing to strip his father of dignity with the stroke of a pen, then what wouldn't he do to keep his own son under control? The voicemail replayed itself in his head word for word until it no longer felt like a message but a plea. "Don't worry, I'm okay." He pressed the phone to his ear again, playing it one last time, and as the message ended, he whispered into the silence, "No, Evan, you're not okay, but you will be." He returned to his desk, dragging a yellow legal pad in front of him. He wrote down the time of the call, the words of the voicemail, as best he could recall them, every detail that might matter later. His hand was steady now, steadier than it had been in days. This wasn't just about property anymore. This wasn't about signatures or deeds. This was about a boy freezing in the dark because no one had the courage to stop it. The old man set the pen down and looked around the room, the lamplight catching the edges of photographs of faces long gone but never forgotten. Helen's eyes stared back at him from a frame on the shelf, kind and certain, as if urging him forward. She would have never allowed this. She would have fought with fire and steel to keep Evan safe. And now it was his turn. He picked up the phone again, scrolling through the contacts until Alan's name glowed on the screen. His finger hovered, but he didn't press yet. Not tonight. Tonight he needed to gather strength to prepare. The fight ahead was no longer just a father against a son. It was a grandfather standing between a child and a legacy of cruelty. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, carrying with it the sharp bite of winter. He imagined Evan hearing that same wind from the other side of a thin garage door, curling tighter into himself, waiting for morning. The image hardened something inside him. He shut off the lamp, leaving the house in darkness, and stood tall against the silence. The voicemail still echoed in his ears, but it no longer sounded like a wound. It sounded like a call to arms. And deep down, he knew this message was only the beginning. Because if Mark thought he could break a boy with cold air and silence, he was about to learn what true resistance looked like. The night pressed down heavy, but his mind was sharper than it had been in years. The voicemail from Evan still echoed in his ears, every word cutting like ice, every pause filled with the sound of chattering teeth. He had spent hours pacing the house, rage tightening his chest, sorrow gnawing at his bones. But now there was clarity. Anger alone wouldn't save the boy. It needed action. Cold, deliberate, undeniable action. He picked up the phone again, this time not to replay the voicemail but to dial 3 numbers. The line clicked, a calm dispatcher's voice answered, and he spoke with the kind of measured tone that left no room for doubt. He explained what he had heard, the exact time of the call, the details of punishment disguised as parenting. He repeated the words Evan had said, every syllable seared into his memory, making them evidence now, not just heartbreak. The dispatcher asked questions careful and precise, and he answered them all without hesitation. When the call ended, a strange quiet filled the room, not silence, but the calm that comes after a storm has been set in motion. He moved quickly, his old joints carrying him with a vigor he thought had been lost. In the linen closet, he pulled down the thickest blanket he owned, one Helen had knitted years ago, every loop of yarn filled with her warmth. He laid it on the couch, smoothing the folds, then returned to the kitchen. A pot went on the stove, broth poured in, vegetables chopped with quick practiced strokes. The scent of garlic and onions soon filled the air, clinging to the walls, replacing the stale bitterness that had hung there for days. The soup wasn't just food. It was comfort, safety, a promise made tangible. By the time the knock came at the door, the house was glowing with lamplight, the blanket folded neatly, the soup simmering gently. He opened it to find 2 officers, their breath rising in clouds against the night. Between them stood Evan, small and shivering, his eyes wide with the kind of fear that buries itself deep in a child's bones. The boy's arms clutched a backpack too light to carry much, his thin jacket hanging off his shoulders like it belonged to someone else. The old man's chest tightened, but he forced himself to stand steady, to be the rock the boy needed now. "Come in," he said, his voice low, strong. The officers nodded, their duty done, and with a few clipped words of reassurance they left the child in his care. The door closed behind them, shutting out the cold, shutting out the world. For a moment Evan just stood there, trembling, unsure if he was truly safe. Then the old man knelt, his hand resting gently on the boy's shoulder. "You're home now," he said. No speeches, no questions, just those 3 words. Evan's lip quivered, and then the dam broke. The boy collapsed into his grandfather's arms, sobs muffled against the old man's chest, small fists clutching at his shirt, as though afraid he might vanish too. He held him, arms strong around the fragile frame, and for the first time in weeks, he felt the weight in his chest lift. He carried Evan to the couch, wrapped him in Helen's blanket, and set the steaming bowl of soup on the table beside him. The boy's hands shook as he lifted the spoon, but the first sip brought color back to his cheeks, a flicker of life back into his eyes. The old man sat across from him, watching every bite, each one a small victory against the cold, against cruelty, against despair itself. When the bowl was empty and the boy's eyelids heavy, the old man guided him down the hall to the spare bedroom. It had been years since it held anyone, the bed neatly made, the curtains drawn. He tucked Evan in the blanket, pulled tight, and sat on the edge of the mattress until the boy's breathing steadied, slow and even. The sound filled the house, soft and rhythmic, more powerful than any clock or furnace hum. It was the sound of innocence reclaimed, of hope returning. The old man lingered in the doorway long after Evan's eyes closed. He leaned against the frame, the sight of the boy safe and warm burning into him like a vow. This house, once filled with anger and betrayal, now carried the fragile heartbeat of a child, and he would not let that be stolen again. Back in the living room, he lowered himself into the chair, exhaustion finally tugging at his bones. But it wasn't the exhaustion of defeat. It was the weariness of a man who had finally taken a step, who had done more than rage against injustice. He had fought it and won a battle, however small. The soup pot still simmered, the scent lingering in the air like a promise of tomorrow. He picked up the phone once more, scrolling to Alan's name. His finger hovered, then pressed. When the lawyer answered, the old man's voice was firm. "The boy's with me now. He's safe. But Mark won't stop here. Tomorrow we start. Papers, filings, whatever it takes. I won't let my grandson go back to that." Alan's voice carried approval, steel under the calm. "Then we move quickly. Tonight you've saved him. Tomorrow we make sure he never has to be saved again." The call ended and the old man leaned back, closing his eyes for the first time without dread clawing at his ribs. Down the hall, the soft breathing of a boy filled the house, a lullaby more powerful than any hymn. Hope was fragile, yes. But tonight it was alive, and it lived under his roof. And as sleep finally pulled at his eyelids, he knew this was only the beginning. Because saving the boy once wasn't enough. The war for his future had only just begun. The morning of the meeting arrived with a brittle chill, the kind of cold that seeped into the bones even when the sun was shining. He dressed carefully, not in his work clothes, but in the dark wool suit that had seen funerals and courtrooms. Evan was still asleep down the hall, his small frame tucked beneath Helen's blanket, and for a moment he considered canceling everything, staying there to guard the boy against the world. But this day wasn't about choice. It was about survival. Chapel House sat by the river like a relic from another age. Its red bricks weathered the oak beams inside, darkened by decades of smoke and laughter. He walked in with Alan at his side, the lawyer's presence quiet but commanding. Mark was already there, seated at a corner table, dressed too sharply for a man seeking reconciliation. The table was set with silverware gleaming like scalpels, a roast glistening in the center, wine glasses half filled as if to suggest celebration. Mark rose with a smile that was too thin, too rehearsed. "Dad," he said, his voice coated in honey. "I'm glad you came." The old man met his gaze without a word, his face carved from stone. They sat. The waiter poured water. The clink of glass was the only sound before Alan leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "Let's keep this civil. No shouting, no surprises." But the surprise came anyway. Halfway through the meal, Mark reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a neat stack of papers clipped together, the edges pristine. He slid them across the table with a flourish, as if he were offering dessert instead of betrayal. "Just a formality," he said casually. "Temporary power of attorney. Nothing permanent. It's just in case something happens. You know, to make things easier. For you. For all of us." The father didn't touch the papers. He didn't even glance at them. He kept his eyes on his son, steady and unblinking. Alan reached for the stack, flipping the first few pages, his brows knitting tighter with every line. He placed them back down carefully, like handling a weapon. "This isn't temporary," he said flatly. "This is a transfer of control. If he signs this, he loses everything, every right, every decision, permanently." Mark's smile faltered but didn't vanish. "That's not how it's meant. It's just precaution. Look, Dad, you've been under stress. You've got too much to manage. This way I can help. Take some weight off your shoulders." The father leaned back in his chair, his hand resting on the table. Fingers curled slightly as though testing the grain of the wood beneath them. His voice, when it came, was quiet, deliberate. "You think I don't see it? You think I don't hear the hunger in your voice? You brought me here to this place that once meant family, just to push paper across a table." Mark shifted his eyes, flicking nervously toward Alan, then back. "It's for your own good. You could sign it now. We could finish this peacefully. No courts, no mess." The father's gaze sharpened. "Peaceful." He reached across the table, tapped the stack of papers once with his finger. "There's nothing peaceful about theft dressed as concern, nothing decent about stealing from the hand that fed you." Mark's tone hardened, the mask slipping. "If you don't sign now, I'll find another way. The law doesn't need your permission." The old man's chest tightened, but not with fear. It was something darker, steadier, forged in disappointment. He straightened his eyes, never leaving his son's, and then he spoke, each word cutting through the air like a blade. "You gave my grandson cold where warmth should have been." The room seemed to still at the sentence. The waiter froze in the corner. Alan set his fork down slowly, and Mark's face paled as if the words had reached deeper than he expected. The old man continued, his voice rising just enough to leave no doubt. "You made him sleep in a garage. You told him it would make him stronger when all it made him was cold. You will never have power over me, because the moment you abandoned your own son, you lost the right to claim mine." Mark's mouth opened, but no sound came. The color drained from his face, replaced with the flush of anger clawing its way back. He shoved the papers forward again, more forceful this time. "You're making a mistake," he snapped. "This is your chance to make things right. To make it easier for everyone." The father pushed the stack back across the table with one steady motion. "I don't make deals with men who let children freeze." Alan shifted in his seat, his voice calm but sharp as glass. "This meeting is over." Mark's hand slammed against the table, the silverware rattling, the glasses nearly toppling. "You'll regret this," he spat. His voice rose, the polished veneer shattering into raw fury. "When the courts decide, when everything is stripped from you, you'll wish you had signed." The father didn't flinch. He lifted his glass of water, took a slow sip, then set it back down with precision. "Then let the courts decide." But know this: every night when you close your eyes, you'll see your boy shivering in the dark. And you'll know that was the night you lost everything that mattered. The table stood between them like a battlefield, but the war had already been decided. Mark gathered the papers, shoving them into his briefcase with clumsy hands. He didn't finish his meal. He didn't even look back as he stormed out of Chapel House, the door slamming so hard the windows trembled. The old man sat in the quiet that followed Alan beside him, the untouched roast cooling between them. He felt no triumph, no relief. Only the certainty that his son's war was far from finished. He reached for his coat, his mind already calculating the next steps. Because if Mark thought one stack of papers could undo him, he hadn't yet learned what resistance looked like in a man who had nothing left to lose, but everything to protect. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the anger, beneath the exhaustion, there was a darker knowledge this was only the first shot in a battle that would stretch far beyond this table. The drive back from Chapel House felt longer than it should have. The river ran black under the moon. The trees leaned in as though whispering warnings, and the old man's grip on the steering wheel was white-knuckled. Beside him the passenger seat sat empty, but in his mind he could see Evan there, small hands folded in his lap, eyes watching every mile tick by. That thought steadied him, reminded him why this war wasn't about signatures or threats. It was about a boy who had been robbed of warmth, of safety, of the simple comfort every child deserved. When he stepped through his front door, the house greeted him with quiet, not hollow silence, but the kind that carried weight. Down the hallway came the faint sound of even breathing. Evan was still asleep, wrapped in Helen's blanket, the same one that had once kept Mark warm when storms rattled the windows decades ago. The old man walked softly, his boots barely brushing the worn boards, and paused at the threshold. There he was. The boy's face was calm. No trace of fear, no shiver pulling at his lips. The lamp he had left burning glowed softly, casting golden light over the blanket's woven patterns. For the first time in weeks, the boy was safe. For the first time, he was home. The old man eased down on the edge of the bed, his hand brushing lightly over Evan's hair. The boy stirred, half-awake eyes blinking slowly open. "Grandpa," he whispered, his voice hoarse with sleep. "I'm here," the old man said, steady and certain. He pulled the blanket tighter around him and leaned down, his words quiet but firm. "You're warm now, kiddo. Warm and going home." The boy let out a long breath, the kind that emptied fear from the lungs, and closed his eyes again. His small hand slipped into his grandfather's fingers, curling there with trust that had been missing too long. The old man stayed there unmoving, the sound of the boy's steady breathing filling the room like a hymn. He thought of all that had passed. The slam of doors, the threats, the schemes wrapped in paper. He thought of Chapel House, of his son's face twisted in anger, and of the documents that now lay powerless on the table. None of it mattered in this moment. The only thing that mattered was the boy's warmth, the boy's safety, the boy's future. He rose carefully, pulling the door until it clicked shut, leaving Evan in the cocoon of peace he had been denied. In the living room he sank into his chair, exhaustion finally catching up to him. But it wasn't the weariness of defeat. It was the kind that followed battle, the kind that carried the promise of tomorrow. His body ached, his mind burned, but his heart held fire still. The camera of life, if such a thing existed, would have caught him there. An old man framed in lamplight, face lined by years, but eyes sharp with resolve. He knew Mark would not stop. He knew the fight would continue. But tonight he had won something greater than papers and threats. Tonight he had reclaimed his grandson's trust. And that trust was worth more than land, more than deeds, more than any signature could steal. He turned his gaze outward, past the walls, past the night pressing against the windows, as though speaking not just to the empty room, but to every ear willing to listen. His voice, low and steady, carried the weight of truth. If you believe no child should suffer cold, as punishment, share this story. Let it spread wider than the silence that tries to bury it. Subscribe, stay with me, because this fight isn't mine alone. It belongs to every grandparent, every parent, every soul who knows that warmth is not a privilege but a right. Together we make sure no child is left in the dark. The words lingered in the room, echoing with a power beyond one man's voice. Outside the wind rattled the trees, but inside the house was steady lit from within, not just by lamps, but by something stronger. Hope. And somewhere down the hall, a boy slept soundly, his breath, even his body, warm proof that for one night, at least, love had won over cruelty. Yet beyond that door, shadows still gathered, waiting for their turn. The old man leaned back, eyes closing, not in surrender, but in preparation. Because this story wasn't finished. It was only the beginning of a war he was now ready to fight, and he wasn't fighting it alone. Life has a way of testing us in the most painful places: family, loyalty, and trust. This story is more than a battle over property or papers. It is a reminder that dignity and love are values worth defending no matter the cost. For older generations, it speaks to the strength that comes from experience, the wisdom to recognize manipulation, and the courage to stand firm even when it means standing alone. Most of all, it shows that protecting the innocent, our grandchildren, the future, must always outweigh greed and betrayal. Many seniors know the sting of being overlooked or dismissed, yet this story proves that age is not weakness. It is resolve, hardened by years of sacrifice. The lesson is simple but powerful. Never allow cruelty to masquerade as discipline, and never surrender what you've built to those who have forgotten respect. Hold on to your principles, because they are the legacy your children and grandchildren will truly inherit. If you believe no child should ever suffer cold in place of love, subscribe and share this story today. Your voice might be the one that inspires change.